What do Andy Burnham, Andy Street, Ruth Davidson, Donald Trump, Mark Carney and Kemi Badenoch have in common? Well, they'll all be subject to the conversation that we're going to have today on the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome to the latest Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, and joined by Jo Phillips. If you're watching on YouTube, you will see Jo, who's going to give us a wave now. There you go. And the invisible Jim Hancock, who sadly has not been able to get his camera working on his computer this week. Apparently, there is something within his computer that will simply refuse to have bald-headed men
Told you.
on the camera. So
say something unkind.
there can't be any other reason. So apologies for the gremlins and apologies for those who love to see young James in all his glory and his pink jumpers, but this week you'll just have to listen to him and his words of wisdom. Now, there's been a lot going on, as I said in the introduction, politically. We're not a 5-6 hour podcast, so we won't possibly be able to cover everything that's happened during the past 7 days. But the big story of the weekend, of course, was the decision of Labour's National Executive Committee to turn down Andy Burnham's request to stand in the forthcoming Gorton by-election in Greater Manchester, which has been caused by the resignation of Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn, a Labour MP who'd been suspended from the party for some very unfortunate WhatsApp messages that he'd shared in a Labour Manchester members group. So Andy Burnham's not going to be allowed to stand for reasons which the National Executive Committee have set out, largely on the basis of the cost that a mayoral by-election in Greater Manchester would result in, and that's some £3.5 million. So that cost, obviously, of £3.5 million is the reason that the NEC is saying that it will be a bit daft to allow a mayor to contest the seat. But of course, what critics of Keir Starmer and the current leadership are suggesting is that the Prime Minister is for it and is stopping Burnham returning to Parliament because he fears a challenge from the Greater Manchester Mayor for his job. Now, it's all been a little bit of a mess, so unlike this Labour government to get themselves into a communications turmoil. But on Friday evening, I attended the Labour Party regional Northwest dinner, and it seemed to me at the time fairly unlikely that Andy Burnham would be allowed to stand and contest the seat. It was that time on Friday night, an awful lot of people still saying to me that they doubted that Andy would throw his hat in the ring. But I think from his perspective, it was sort of now or never. But from Labour's perspective, do they need the distraction of an Andy Burnham return to Parliament? And let me just put the decision or the reason for the decision into some context as far as those costs of a Greater Manchester mayoral contest are concerned. You will all be aware, I guess, that there have been, I think, about 30 local elections cancelled for May or postponed because combined authorities are about to be established in those areas. So the argument goes, why elect a councillor for a year? Because in 12 months' time, new local authorities will be in place in those areas, and therefore those councillors would only serve a 12-month term. The cost, again, has been cited as the reason for postponing those elections. So just to put this into as small a nutshell as I can, Burnham stopped from standing costs of election campaigns cited as the main reason, and continued internal turmoil for Labour. So, Mr. Hancock, what are you making of it?
It was the right decision. It's interesting that it was carried by 8 votes to 1 by this team. There was a lot of talk about internal dissent within the subcommittee of the National Executive, but 8-1 shows that he's got the backing of his internal coterie. I mean, obviously, some people analyse that as being half the problem with the way Starmer's running the Labour Party, that he's got a coterie of people around him that are defending him to the last. But nevertheless, I think it is the right decision, because even if Andy had won this by-election, his return to Parliament would have just created an unsustainable frenzy of speculation. However many protestations he made of initial loyalty and all that sort of thing, that people would continue to be asking, trying to look for indication that he was going to challenge the Prime Minister, and it would have been unsustainable. So we know the political reasons why this is done. You've stated the economic reasons. I think the argument by Starmer's people that reform would win the Greater Manchester mayoral election is overstated. I mean, within the city of Manchester, I don't think there's much support for reform. I acknowledge that there is in some of the outer boroughs, but I think that's been hyped up in order to sustain the case. However, it remains the case that if Sir Keir Starmer, which he should be with a thumping majority like this less than 2 years into office, was steaming along, doing well, then he probably could have regarded with insouciance the return of what would be, if he behaved himself, a good addition to the cabinet eventually. But we aren't in that position. Starmer's people are defending themselves. It really is a choice for Starmer's people really to, either call it a day or else to fight hard. And if he's going to fight hard, it would create that frenzy in Parliament. And therefore, just to finish off, a little tip, which is just my idea. I've not talked to anyone. What about John Ashworth to fight the Denton and Gorton seat? Defeated by a Gaza candidate in Leicester, a very solid man, good performer, and has Northwest connections. So that's my view on it, Frank.
Yeah, not a moment now, Jim. And I think we can almost guarantee now that it's going to be an all-female shortlist. Jo, what's your take on it?
Well, it doesn't look good for either Keir Starmer or Andy Burnham. And there was a part of me at the weekend was hoping that Andy Burnham would say something statesmanlike along the lines of, the international situation is so grave at the moment. I don't think the British people need a distraction of internal politics of the Labour Party, so I'm not standing. And I think that would have been a good thing to do, because, of course, what he signalled is, I couldn't care less about Manchester, which, of course, we know is not true. But it's, if you're willing to throw that away, having worked so hard to achieve everything that he's done in Manchester, it's a bit sour. I think they were wrong, as you say, to sort of big up the risk of reform winning, because that makes them look frit. But I also think your point is absolutely right, Frank. You can't cancel local elections on the grounds of costs and then have one that is entirely about the Labour Party. I mean, it's just not feasible. So I think it is the right decision. I think the way it was handled was dreadful. And I think it would have been sensible if Andy Burnham and Keir Starmer had been able to have a conversation before it got to this level, where, if somebody had said to Andy, look, the chances are it's going to be blocked because of cost, he might have then been in a position to make the right noises and say, I'm not doing it because I don't want to distract. What's going on in the world is more important than me.
Yeah, I can see the case for both sides. I think from the party's point of view and the leadership of the party, should I say, the case that both of you have made is a fair one. And, you both made the point that the cost of those elections will be significant. £3.5 million. It's a big chunk of change, is that. Then you've got the prospect of, I think, genuine prospect of Labour losing the mayoralty of Greater Manchester, because not only would you be under attack from Reform, but you've got the Green Party, you've got the Palestinian independence. There's a whole range of things that could go wrong in a regional mayoral election. So I think the party privately were right to be concerned about that. Why, oh why, they decided to make that part of the public statement that they made is beyond me, because simply the cost argument was enough as far as I was concerned. From Andy's perspective, he's probably thinking, look, I'm sort of mid-50s now. This might be my last chance to realistically go for the leadership. If Keir Starmer does fall on his sword after May, which some people are suggesting will happen, I'm still not convinced. But if that does happen, then of course we'll have a new leader elected. Andy Burnham will not be able to stand against Keir Starmer or anybody else for that matter, and therefore the chances, the prospects of Labour doing a Conservative Party and having another leadership contest within the next couple of years is unlikely. So equally, I can see from his perspective, he was thinking, I've got to get myself back to Westminster as quickly as possible. The criticism that you would make of Andy would be this: if he had ambitions to go back to Westminster, he should have done it 2 years ago. He should not have stood for the mayoralty again. Labour would have won that hands down, of course, whoever the candidate would have been selected as a replacement for Andy, and he could have found himself a seat then. So in some respects, I've got some sympathy for him, but in others, I think, well, from a political decision-making perspective, you've not really handled this well. And the other point that you make, Joe, and again, why the National Executive Committee did not make this part of their statement, or at least get ministers to make this as part of the case against a Burnham run for the Gorton by-election. The international situation at this moment in time is so fraught that why do we need a Prime Minister distracted with a potential leadership challenge? And, you know, it's for the birds, isn't it, to think that Andy wants to come back to Parliament and Westminster to be a backbench MP representing the good people of Gorton. He wants to come back because he wants to challenge the Prime Minister for his job. It's obvious. So it is going to be a huge distraction. And as I say, if I was Shabana Mahmood or Steve Reid or one of the cabinet members who were put up to argue the case as to why Andy Burnham's exclusion was correct, I definitely would have been saying, let's have a look at what's happening internationally as well. Yeah. And do the British people really appreciate internal warfare in the Labour Party when we've got potential real warfare in our geopolitics? So I think there were good reasons for him to be excluded, but as I say, equally, I could see where Andy was coming from. And I have to say, it's disappointing, isn't it, that we've got the fallout between the leadership and one of Labour's best communicators, Jeb.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's it's a real shame, and I hope it's something that will blow over quite quickly. I think Andy Burnham's supposed to be doing something today, some policy launch or something, which I think will be his first public appearance. And it is beholden on both of them actually to be really grown up and really statesmanlike and just say, look, it's happened. That's the rules of the Labour Party. We've both got really big jobs to do. Let's just get on with it. And I think it's unfortunate that Angela Rayner came out in support of Andy Burnham, because that then creates an issue about whether she comes back to the cabinet, whether she has another position of power or leadership or something. So I think, they just need to, and I think this focus on international stuff, I know everybody's concerned about what's happening domestically, but I'm sure we'll talk about it later on. But, what's happened and what we've seen in the last 7 days from Trump and his comments about service people and all the rest of it is just beyond the pale. And we really need Keir Starmer, for all his weaknesses, he's actually doing all right internationally.
Can I just say, just before you coming back in, Jim, of course, that this could have potentially all been resolved had Keir Starmer and the cabinet taken my advice months and months ago now to invite Andy Burnham as the leader of the mayors, because he's clearly the most high profile of all of the elected mayors across the country, into the cabinet as the regional representative. And that could have been done, a place in the Lords perhaps, to make sure that he could also appear before Parliament to answer questions, or just have him there as an advisor and observer. He doesn't even need the bloody red boxes and the ministerial cars. And that may have been a way in which you could have kept Andy Burnham in the tent. As I say, I think we've not made as much use of his talents as we ought to, of a government. But the other point that you made there, Joe, Angela Rayner wasn't the only one. No. Lucy Powell, she of course deputy leader of the party now, was the one person who did vote for Andy Burnham's potential candidacy at the by-election. And then Ed Miliband, of all people, saying that he thought it would be right. And Ed Miliband keeps saying, oh, I'm not interested in the leadership art, or I've done that once, I don't want to. But I'm not convinced. He doesn't seem to be batting for Keir Starmer at the moment. Jim, sorry, you wanted to come back in.
No, that's the issue I wanted to sort of come on to now. Has this sort of stilled the fever? I mean, I alluded to the fact that I thought if Andy was back in Westminster, it would reach unsustainable levels. But you've alluded to Ed Miliband, who's playing a slightly strange game. But the people that concern me most of all are, what are Angela Rayner and Lucy Powell going to do now? Because they sort of represent the Manchester faction. And, are they going to continue to put pressure on the leadership issue? And there's obviously Wes Streeting, and Wes has come fairly close to the flame with one or two of his comments. But are they all now going to calm down, or are they going to be like proxies for the Andy Burnham situation, and the fever atmosphere that I forecast in Westminster won't be that much cooler, even with Andy not there? I mean, just one last thing. We do need to remind ourselves that for years, Andy said how glad he was to be away from Westminster. I can get real things done in Manchester. I'm dealing with real people. I'm not in that hothouse. I'm not aware that he ever actually repudiated that until the moment he said he was interested in becoming an MP again. So the mood music from Andy hasn't been very pro-Westminster up until now.
I don't think he ever was pro-Westminster, even in the statements he's made latterly. What he said is that the government of, let's use the language that he probably used privately, have ballsed it up in a way that none of us would have foresaw, and therefore he thinks that he could do a better job as Prime Minister than Keir Starmer. That is basically what he's saying. And from a communication point of view, he's certainly much better. He's one of the best media performers. He's somebody that connects with people. His popularity ratings, I think, are at sort of +7, +8, which doesn't sound massively impressive, but in comparison to -53, which I think is where Keir Starmer's ratings are at the moment, then it's Real Madrid, isn't it? Compared to Plymouth. So
maybe one on Saturday, man.
I think that you can make an argument either way. I think, in terms of the Andy Burnham situation, I think ultimately I would probably come down on the basis that the National Executive Committee have made the right decision, but once again the communications around it not great. Why oh why, as Joe said, there weren't sort of private phone calls and backroom deals to be done between the Prime Minister and the Mayor of Greater Manchester. We'll never know. They may have attempted to do that, but I'd be surprised, because Keir Starmer doesn't seem to be particularly good at politics. And the only thing I'd say about Lucy Powell is, yes, she did support Andy Burnham's bid to be a parliamentary candidate, but equally, she's been very firm in her support of Keir Starmer since she was elected as deputy leader, and on every possible occasion says, we should not be distracted by internal battles, and we should not be talking about the Prime Minister's position. So we'll see what happens over the next few months. I don't think that Andy Burnham coming back to Parliament would have helped take any of the heat out of the conversation that is happening over Keir Starmer's future, that's for sure. Whether or not this means that Keir Starmer's future will stop being talked about, well, I very much doubt it. Let me just move the conversation on briefly to those local elections that have been cancelled or postponed, whichever word you wish to use. I think cancelled is the right word, because they're never going to happen, are they, if local government reorganisation takes place. And again, for listeners and viewers, just to briefly explain, council elections in May in places like Lancashire, for example. So the local authorities in the districts of Lancashire were offered the opportunity to cancel the elections that were due in May on the basis that in 12 months' time, those local authorities may not exist, and therefore the cost would be a bit daft given the fact that you are electing councillors for simply a 12-month term. So West Lancashire, which is probably the place I know best, have decided to take the offer that the government have made to cancel those elections, and have said the £350,000 that would have been spent on the poll will now be spent on saving the swimming baths in Skelmersdale. That seems a perfectly logical and pragmatic position to take for me, but I know Jim is a little bit concerned about the threat to democracy, James.
Not particularly. I mean, I support the situation. I'm aware of the argument about democracy that's largely being raised by Reform UK, who are obviously desperate to take advantage of their popularity at the moment, though it seems to be coming off its peak. No, I genuinely support it. I mean, Lancashire is the fulcrum for this discussion because there were so many district council elections going to be held in places like Chorley and West Lancashire, and of course we have the prospect of a combined authority next year. So I think it's the right decision. It's silly to elect councillors in Chorley for only 1 year, and again, the cost of it, and that's a lovely example if a swimming pool's being kept open. I mean, that can't be the argument for never having elections. I mean, we have all this, we can all be swimming and not voting forever. So we're not saying that. They were offered the choice, if they wanted to go ahead, I suppose they could have done so. So I do generally support it. There obviously are precedents of a slightly different kind, and not in distant memory either. Foot and mouth disease, COVID, all those things have caused the postponement of elections. In some parts of the rest of the country, I think there is a slightly more worrying thing that it's a second postponement.
Yes, exactly.
So some people will be in office for 7 years, which is a long time in local government. My only concern, Frank, is given the fraught nature, particularly of the attempts to get a rational local government structure in Lancashire, the government and everybody better get their heads together and get it in place for next year. Because I can see we could be all back here again with squabbling and indecision at central level, indecision at local level, and Lancashire still won't be voting. That would be a big concern for me.
And I can't obviously comment as much on the other 29 or however many elections have been cancelled across the country, but I would share your concern, Jim. I'm not convinced that in 12 months' time, Lancashire are going to be in the position to say, right, we've created these new local authorities now, off you go to the polls. It seems to me that they're nowhere near agreement in terms of what local government reorganisation should look like in the county. And therefore, are we seriously saying that come this time next year, the government are going to be saying to Lancashire, well, you've not got your act together yet, so if you want to postpone the elections again, you can. That, I think, Joe, would be unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think it is wrong to cancel elections. But, there's an awful lot of people leaping up and down, not least of all Reform, but also the Liberal Democrats. It's an assault on democracy, which it is fundamentally wrong to cancel elections. We are not in an emergency, but I can see the argument. But it should have been made really clear. It's the sort of thing that Labour actually could have put in their manifesto, that we want to reorganise local government, and we will be talking to local governments about whether they have got the capability, so you could have put it out there instead of coming out, right, no, they're going to be cancelled, that's it. And this thing about councillors being in position for 7 years, that means people have been denied a vote for 7 years, which is a long time. But the one point I would make is an awful lot of people who are bleating and jumping on the bandwagon, I'd love to know how many of them actually bother to go out and vote. Because, the reality is that in a lot of local elections, the turnout is, 30% if you're lucky, and that depends whether it's raining. So I think, we need to be really honest with ourselves. Do you go out and vote, or do you just think they are doing something wrong when they is actually we? And I think, some of the response back to the people who are criticising should be, well, did you go and vote? I mean, it's worth noting as well that Reform are trying to get a judicial review against this, which may change things. And the Electoral Commission has also said that they're not happy about it. So, it's not just the normal candidates, if you like, usual suspects. But I do think, on the scale of things in terms of funding, and if you can use an example like you did for Scansdale, well, that's a perfect thing. But that's up to local councillors who could say to people, we're doing this because, and that means we can do X instead of Y. And a lot of them aren't. And it does look like, and again, on the back of the threat to a possible mayoral election in Manchester and a by-election, it does look as though Labour are frightened that they're going to lose, and they can't afford to look frit.
Again, it comes down to that thing that we've said so often, communications.
Yeah.
I should point out that it's not just Labour councils that have opted to postpone elections. Conservative controlled councils have as well, using that cost of a poll that, as I say, is going to stand for 12 months as the reason, the rationale. So we'll see whether that judicial review goes anywhere. I doubt it, because as Jim said, there have been many times in the past actually where elections for all sorts of reasons have been postponed. So we'll see. We may come back to this issue in future weeks. Let's move our discussion on to the Conservative Party then, because Kemi Badenoch's had an interesting week as well. Of course, last weekend, maybe a couple of days before, Robert Jenrick defected, and he's been on the media rounds saying all sorts of complimentary things about his former colleagues in government, and spelling out all the problems that have created broken Britain, most of which seems to me were the result of policies adopted by the Conservative government, of which Robert Jenrick was a member. But there you go. He was also a member of, a Minister for Immigration, and he said that the immigration system is out of control. And of course, he was Minister for Housing, and he's suggested that we've got a bit of a housing crisis in this country. If only Robert Jenrick would have been given some responsibility to sort those issues out. Anyway, I think Kemi Badenoch, as we said last week, handled that particular defection reasonably well. Some other guy, Rosendale, I think his name, left as well this week, but no one's heard of him and nobody really cares. And she's come out now and said, look, if you want to go, because we just want to crack on and revive the Tory party's fortunes. Over the weekend, the far more interesting and thoughtful approach has been taken by two Conservative politicians who I really rate. One, Ruth Davidson, former leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, of course. The other, Andy Street, who we worked with quite closely when he was the Mayor of West Midlands. Very impressive personality, who I think it's fair to say only for the toxicity of the Tory brand would have maintained his position of Mayor of the West Midlands, because most people considered he was doing a good job there. So Davidson and Street have come up with the idea of establishing a movement which I've been told is going to be called Prosper, which will encourage Kemi Badenoch and her colleagues to move more central as far as their policy prospectus is concerned. Again, Jo, I have to say, we've been saying this for a number of weeks now. They need to get themselves onto the economy, leave the woke politics behind, and immigration looks as though it's falling, and it will be good for the Conservatives if it does, because it takes an awful lot of steam out of the reform bandwagon.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, I think, Ruth Davidson and Andy Street are both extremely good communicators. They're both very, very excellent politicians, and they're very collegiate in their approach. And I think this is a good thing. I think Kemi Badenoch has definitely got a spring in her step, and who wouldn't, having got rid of Robert Jenrick the way she did. Just a question for the listeners and viewers, a little thing to ponder. Robert Jenrick's constituency, Newark, is an anagram of how he is mainly described. I'll leave you to think on that one for a minute. But I think on a more serious note, although I was slightly stunned that Kemi Badenoch on Desert Island Disc at the weekend chose a Michael Jackson song to start off with, because you sort of think, maybe I'd have gone with something else and put him in as the third choice. But I think there is growing pressure on the Conservatives to go back to a much more centrist thing. And I think the drift of these people like Jenrick and Rossendale and Nadeem Zahawi to reform is making Conservative voters who might have been tempted go, hang on a minute, no, I think I'd rather go back. And I think, she's now got the opportunity to really put her stamp on it, but they need to come out with some policies. I mean, she's had 18 months of not coming out with anything deliberately and probably quite wisely, but we need to move on from, broken Britain. And her interview last weekend, in fact, we mentioned it, was much more upbeat and optimistic. Yes, you can say something's broken, but what you need to do is say how you're going to fix it. So I think it would be a good thing, and it would be a good thing for the country to have an effective opposition. Whether they can move into the centre, I don't know. But I think, Andy Street and Ruth Davidson could be the people who, and it's important to say it's a movement, it's not a party. Yes. They're not trying to set up an alternative Conservative party.
Yeah, they're trying to influence policy from within, which is legitimate, and there are many groups within the Labour and Conservative Party who do likewise, of course. I think the other point that you make there, Jo, is a good one. If the Conservatives and Kemi Badenoch do start to get their act together, then that strong opposition is something that we would all welcome. Mm-hmm. And in fairness, what Kemi Badenoch's been able to do, I think, in recent months, is come up with sort of sound bites and phrases that will resonate with people. So she said, after the budget, it's Benefit Street, that sort of caught on with the media and was picked up by commentators moving the debate in the direction of the Conservatives. And then over the weekend, I noticed that she started to say, no, it's not Britain that's broken, it's politics in this country that's broken. And again, I thought, Jim, that was a good phrase for her to use. She seems to be getting much better at this job as leader of the opposition.
She is, but she is a right-of-centre Conservative leader. She is not James Cleverly or Mel Stride, who I hope you notice is the most popular member of the Shadow Cabinet, according to a survey I read last week. She is not the sort of person that can, even if she wanted to, and I think her instincts are against it, support the aspirations of Prosper insofar as we can discern them at the moment. Yesterday, Ruth and Andy were asked on the Kunzberg show about some issues, like, for instance, whether they supported us leaving the ECHR. Yeah. They couldn't answer that. What is their attitude? They're probably very pro-European. They'd like to see us much closer to Europe. Kemi Badenoch can't do that. On immigration, I don't suppose they've got the appetite for the tough approach that Kemi wants to support. The Conservative Party members, even those that might want to follow Ruth and Andy to a more centrist position, daren't do it because they're looking over their shoulders at reform. Davidson and Street need to join the Liberal Democrats. It's a waste of time, this Prosper thing, in my opinion.
Could be an even bigger waste of time joining the Liberal Democrats. I think that Andy Street is, got a great opportunity to come back as Mayor of the West Midlands if Labour continues to struggle nationally. And I think Ruth Davidson likewise has got that national stage. Probably not that interesting going back into politics, frontline politics at least. And as they both said over the weekend, rightly, I think, imagine if people like Neil Kinnock, Roy Hattersley would have abandoned the Labour Party in the early 80s because the Social Democrat Party emerged as being popular for a few years at that time. Or indeed, Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves and others would have walked away from Labour when Corbyn took over as leader of the Labour Party. You've got to stay in and fight. You can't just be flitting about from bloody party to party. Gosh, man, it's like me suggesting to you that you should go and support Portsmouth or another crap football team. You're a Plymouth man, stick with Plymouth. Jo's a West Ham fan, she sticks with West Ham. Her politics are Liberal, stick with the Liberals. I'm Labour, I stuck with Labour when I was appalled by some of the things Jeremy Corbyn was doing, but I was never going to come out of the Labour Party. So I think that credit to Andy Street and Ruth Davidson for staying, for fighting, for trying to persuade their colleagues within the Conservative Party towards an agenda that I think would be far more attractive to the British electorate, far more pragmatic. I hear what you say about Kenny Baker not being centre right or to the right of the Conservative Party, but she will want to win. And if Andy, Ruth and others can start to come up with a policy prospectus that suggests it can be popular in the country, then she may be persuaded to just have a bit of a lighter touch in terms of some of the issues that she's talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, I think immigration, the way it's coming down, we're going to soon be in that conversation of what economic damage is immigration policy having on the country, because we're heading towards zero now, Jim, net zero on immigration.
Really?
Yeah. By this time next year, you could be in a situation where people are saying, we've got to do something to get some more immigrants into the country because the economy's on the floor.
But the problem with that is that you've got people, 2,000 people marching in Crowborough, whipped up, no doubt, by, hostile and malevolent forces like Tommy Robinson and his ilk, and probably Reform as well. And that's a place where people can't vote, where the elections will be, and those sort of things play into this sense of nobody's listening to us, nobody cares, we can only go this way. And I think, I just think if Ruth Davidson and Andy, they've articulated this thing about people who feel politically homeless.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of people who feel politically homeless, but who care very much about democracy and they want to vote. They don't want to go to the extremes to Reform or the Greens. Labour there, isn't working. The Conservatives have been too far looking into their own navels and, self-imploding.
But that's always been the picture of the Liberal Democrats. Come to us. You are politically homeless. Come to us. Surely you'd welcome Ruth Davidson and Andy Street into the Lib Dems.
Well, of course, but I think, I think that's a neither here nor there. And I think, as Frank said, the point is you stick with your party. You stick with what you believe in, because if you suddenly just flip-flop, and there's an awful lot of, well, not a lot, but there are some rumours doing the rounds that people in the Liberal Democrats are not very happy with Ed Davey, that they think he's not cutting through, despite the fact that they've got over 70 MPs. And it may be that the Lib Dems are the next ones to look at a leadership challenge at some point. But no, I think Ruth Davidson and Andy Street remind people that actually there is a decent part of the Conservative Party. It just needs to be refound. And actually, you know, if you look at James Cleverly or Mel Stride, and even Priti Patel, for heaven's sake, criticising Donald Trump in quite stern tones. And I think, you know, what you're seeing because of what's happening, you know, outside of this little island is a real shift that people are actually having to decide where they stand. And I think that then puts a whole, you know, in all of this misery, the silver lining is that it may make people think our future is definitely with Europe, and Keir Starmer needs to be bold and brave and say that's where we go.
You are never going to get the Conservative Party to embrace that point of view. They are rapidly anti-Europe.
I'm not saying rejoin, but I think in terms of trade and business, with the way Trump's behaving, I think, and with the threat to Europe and the threat to NATO, I think it's very hard for them to maintain the anti-EU line if they want to be seen as patriotic and putting the country first.
I think I'd make a couple of points. 3 years off a general election, by which time the European Union and our relationship on trade will be far closer and economic benefits will have begun to derive. At that point, it is impossible for the Conservatives to say, well, we're going to go and unravel all that work that Labour have done, even though it's been of benefit to our economy, and even though all the polls are now saying that actually people think it was a mistake to Brexit. So I think that issue will become one that is almost moot, because the close relationships happening, the economic benefits will have been proven and will be evidenced. And as Joe said, the isolationist America makes a coming together of the UK and Europe more and more likely, whichever part of the political spectrum you sit on. As I say, I hear what Joe's saying in terms of immigration, but in 3 years' time, if the Conservatives have got any sense, they'll be joining Labour in saying, we've got it under control. We've still got an issue, of course, on small boats. That's going to be hellishly difficult to sort out. However, the numbers are the numbers, and the Conservatives can take credit for that, because it's some of the policies that they implemented in government that have actually resulted in the big four to, I think it's 200,000 this year, projected to be, as I say, net zero by next. But the thing I'd say to you, Jim, never mind buggering about at the edges, and Andy Street and Ruth Davidson join the Liberal Democrats. As Joe reminds us, Liberal Democrats have got over 70 MPs. Why don't they all join the Tory party? We could take it over. Why don't we do that, Jim?
Because I think no. I'm just proposing.
Honestly,
no, it's not silence at all. In a moment's pause for thought. I think Europe is an absolutely central issue here, and I just cannot conceive of the Conservative Party, even I have to say, my friends Cleverly and Mel Stride, being prepared to accommodate to Europe. I have to remind you,
this from the Liberal Democrats into the Conservative Party. Of course, it'd be easy then for people like Mel Stride, James Cleverly, Ruth Davidson, Andy Street. You've got the numbers. You just simply say to the right of your party, we're in charge now. We've got all these enlightened Liberal Democrats who've joined the Conservative Party. They've taken over. And now the policy, and of course, I speak in gesture, but I do think that it is notable that you've got two people here who've been involved and active in political parties, in Joe and I, who are saying that ain't the way to go, just jumping ship from one party to another. And we've got a political journalist and commentator saying, oh, they should just go and join the Liberal Democrats.
I'm not saying it'll be an easy decision, but I think that's what they should do. And just to be aware of all this move towards Europe and so on, the European Commission have put financial penalties in place, even for the limited amount that the Labour government have done in terms of trade negotiations, because they're so afraid of either the Conservatives or the Reform Party coming to govern this country. So the European Commission don't see this sort of surge for a better links with Europe, and I just don't think the Conservative. I think Ruth and Andy will find it increasingly uncomfortable. They won't be listened to, and I think that has to be an option for them. And either of them, of course, would be quite good leaders of the Liberal Democrats, because I do think Sir Ed, he was doing a nice job yesterday, but it's a very vanilla performance. So let's get them into the Liberal Democrats and then see them in potential leadership positions.
I tell you this. I tell you this for nothing. Andy Street, I am told, was offered a pretty safe Conservative parliamentary seat when he lost his mayoralty, turned it down. I don't think he's interested in going back into Westminster, nor would Ruth Davidson, I don't think, go back into frontline politics. So the idea that either is going to end up as leader of the Liberal Democrats is for the birds. But equally, fucking hell. I mean, this is like playing Football Manager, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with modern politics. It's like you can pick people up and go, here, you go there, you go there. It's ridiculous. It's why people are fed up with politics, quite frankly. You know, stay, argue your case, because, Jim, in 1981 and 1982, had we had such things as podcasts then, you would have been on this programme arguing for Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley to join the SDP.
Well, I mean,
because you'd have been saying, Jim, there is no way Labour's going to change. Look at them. They're anti-Europe. They're about to present the country with the longest suicide note in history. They're absolutely gone. You've got to stay. Well,
as you're inviting me, I mean, what might have happened? The Social Democrats might have been further strengthened, and they wouldn't have collapsed in the face of the Falklands War, and we might have had the sort of the centre party in this country at that time, rather than what we did have, which was infighting for years in Labour. Eventually, Tony Blair was elected more or less like a sort of like the Social Democrats would have been if they got into power. You know, it's all ifs, buts, and maybe. I mean, now, you know, it's nice to be controversial on this programme, and I'm happy to be shot down. My main point is, though, I absolutely seriously stand by, is that I think Ruth and Andy will make their case under this Prosper umbrella, and they won't be listened to. That's my forecast, but I may be proved wrong.
But they might be listened to by the public, Jim, and I think that is the point. If they are going to go out on the road, let's say, and talking to business groups, you know, people, organisations like Downtown or other things, and they're going to be much more visible, that is surely better. Not everybody is talking to people
providing they can persuade Badenoch to change her policies. They can talk on the fringes of the Conservative Party all they like about what they'd like to see the Conservative Party become, pro-European, you know, in favour of a just sort of system of dealing with benefits and all that sort of stuff, encouraging entrepreneurship and so on, but principally, you know, that sort of thing. And they can't be listened to, because the Conservative Party won't take the risk of opening the doors to reform. You imagine how Farage would present that if Badenoch suddenly became a sort of you know, a one nation Conservative Party.
Okay, we're going to wrap the conversation up now, because it is getting into the realms of fantasy. Andy Street and Ruth Davidson will not be joining the Liberal Democrats, but it's good to know that the Liberal Democrats will take anyone. Yeah. And it's also be interesting to speak to Andy and Ruth and say, other than Europe, is there anything else that you agree with the Liberal Democrats on?
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's the problem, Jim. You're sort of obsessed on the one issue there, rather than saying, okay, well, on the other issues that matter to Andy Street and Ruth Davidson, largely I would suggest to you the economy, then they are probably a little out of kilter with the Lib Dems. But there you go. That's just my thinking. And Joe, you and I, we'll stick with our political parties.
Yeah, I think so. It's nice to know we've got some backbone and stay.
Jim will end up in reform by the end of the this parliament.
Hey, what happened to Nigel Farage, who was supposed to be unveiling the Labour defector last week?
Yeah, well, that went all a bit quiet, didn't it? So we'll see. Maybe it's Jim Hancock.
That's disgraceful.
Maybe that's why we can't see him. He's trying on his turquoise jumper.
Absolutely disgraceful. I am a very strong European. I could never have anything to do with Reform UK.
well, it's
And
nice
as
to
you
know.
said, I'm an independent political commentator.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Who's got a slight tendency towards the Liberal Democrats, but we won't go there. Right, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about somebody else who lives in fucking La La Land, Donald Trump.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hesketh, CEO of Savvy Hotels, owner of the Hospitality Hero and co-owner of DivaFest. And I'm here today to share with you our great event that's coming up in collaboration with Downtown in Business, which is the Great Art of Hospitality Conference, happening on the 26th of February in Manchester City Centre at the Treehouse Hotel. This event will bring the creme de la creme of hospitality all in one room. We're looking at 200 individuals coming together to listen to the great operators in hospitality, but likewise some political big hitters to also question them on all things hospitality. We can't wait to see you there.
Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jo Phillips, and the invisible Jim Hancock. I'm just a bit concerned, given the last comments towards the end of the first part of this week's podcast, that it's not actually Jim Hancock. It's an AI bot that Russia have infiltrated his computer and has started to talk tripe. But he reassured me during the break there that no, it is actually him, and he just had a brainwave to suggest that Andy Street and Ruth Davidson joined the Liberal Democrats. But let's crack on and talk about geopolitics, because it's far calmer. Not much happening really. Oh dear me, what a week it has been as far as international affairs are concerned. And it all surrounds this orange clown who is the president of the United States, Donald Trump, who trots off to Davos with this threat of America invading Greenland high on the agenda. You've then got a board of peace unveiled, which is basically Donald Trump as the self-elected chairman with a veto, I have to tell everyone, on this board of peace. And he surrounded himself with a bunch of dictators. So people like Keir, Starmer, Mark Carney and others have said thanks, but no thanks to the invitation. And then you've had what's happening in the States itself, of course, domestically, where another civilian has been murdered by ICE. And there is talk of the National Guard being moved into Minneapolis. And it's just a total and utter shit show. But of course, whilst all these things are being discussed, Epstein is off the agenda. It's not being talked about in America or elsewhere, so he'll be pleased about that. And of course, he just loves the attention, doesn't he? You know, there were queues trying to get in to listen to his meandering speech of an hour and a half when he did speak in Switzerland at Davos. Queues of people trying to get into the conference hall. And by all accounts, it was a pretty boring, ill-effective speech in many respects. And one key thing he did say is, of course, I wouldn't use force to take over Greenland, but we'll try and find other ways of getting a deal. Basically, the deal he's got is the deal he had. You know, the Americans have always had carte blanche in Greenland to put as many troops there as they want and to do as much exploration of the minerals and whatever other goodies that are on that island they want to get their hands on. So he's not really had a deal, but he's trying to sell it as this wonderful thing that he's been able to concoct. The interesting thing that's happened this week for me, though, Joe, is that you had initially Mark Carney make a wonderful speech about the New World Order and saying things that we never thought we would hear in our lifetime, like we're going to have to start getting serious about trade deals with China. You then had Emmanuel Macron, who made an equally impassioned speech for Europe and the rest of the free world, I suppose we can put it that way, to say to them, we've got to start to get our act together. And then finally, on the back of absolutely sickening remarks that Trump made about NATO troops and British troops not actually getting to the front line in Afghanistan. Keir Starmer came out and condemned those comments very clearly, and we probably got as close as we'll ever get to Trump making an apology for those remarks. But it's been another 7 days of disruption, of chaos, of turmoil. Trump loves it because he's in the news every day. Everybody's talking about him. But for the world, for geopolitics, it's an absolute disaster, Jim.
Yeah, oh, completely. And, the one person whose speech you didn't mention was Zelensky, who also launched a broadside against Europe and said, while you're all talking about Greenland, look what's happening in Ukraine. Still, we're going into the 5th year. They've got no power, it's freezing cold. They've got no electricity, and it is absolutely brutal. And it doesn't seem as though they're anywhere nearer to a ceasefire or a peace deal, because Putin doesn't care. He can just string Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner along. I mean, Trump is now a freak show. His incoherent ramblings are insane, and he's gone from being the sort of batty old uncle sitting in the corner to somebody he ought to be taken back to the care home and sedated. He really is a disgrace and a disaster. I think we are living in very frightening times. I think Mark Carney, as I wrote in my blog last week, what he said was absolutely right. No, nostalgia is not a strategy. And the middle powers, which is us and Europe, have got to get together. And I think there's a real opportunity for Europe, goes back to what we were talking about before the break. Together, Europe has got, massive trading power and massive military and defence power. And we need to get together and use that. And we need to work with people like Mark Carney in Canada and other sort of sensible nations. But I think, if you ever wanted to see anything that is more grotesque, it was Trump's comments about troops. It was absolutely appalling. And I am so pleased that Keir Starmer actually was really, straight off and straight up in the chamber in the House of Commons at question time and condemned it, as has everybody else, including Nigel Farage, who rarely condemns anything that Donald Trump says. And I think, from Reform's point of view, I think they have made a very bad judgment, because I think the British public hate Donald Trump. And I think what you're now seeing happen on the streets of Minneapolis, of innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, US citizens being shot dead by untrained, unidentifiable masked ICE agents, and seeing small children, toddlers, taken 1,000 miles away by these ICE agents. And separated from their parents and things. It is grotesque. And I don't know if either of you have seen that film Civil War, which is not the world's most brilliant film, but it was chilling when it came out a couple of years ago, and it is now beginning to look like a documentary.
Yeah, I think what's happening in the States is frightening. And if you look at some of the scenes from this morning, where again there's mass demonstrations on the streets, apparently the hotels where ICE agents are staying have been surrounded by local people trying to get at them. It's a bit like the immigration hotels in the UK, I suppose. But there is so much discontent across the United States, and such a split and a chasm between people. You got Trump's base, which it seems to me to be fracturing somewhat, from the Epstein files to threats to Greenland and NATO, to the rupture in the relationship with Canada. And now, there are Republicans finally getting to their feet and saying this is unacceptable, that innocent people basically being shot dead in the street by our own agents. He's on the ropes as Trump, but that's not a good place for him to be, Jim, because he's an irrational guy. I don't think, and I'm serious when I say this, that he's got a full deck in terms of his mental health this moment in time. It's a real concern, Jim, not just for America, but for the world.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point because we get very, very detailed reports on his physical health. That's almost in the Constitution of the United States. They know what his blood pressure is, but I'm not sure they know what his mental state is. And you do wonder what a psychiatrist would conclude. But the question is, if you look at the impact of all this on the various global situation. It's very, very interesting. I think you referred to the Carney deal with China, and of course China wants to appear as the stable, calm center, and everything that Trump's doing with his instability is playing into China's hands as somebody that is quite attractive for investment. That we are here and we're doing all this. Obviously there's the Taiwan thing that could destabilize things there, but generally speaking, this turbulence from Trump is actually playing into China's hands. In terms of Russia, of course, they just fight on. I mean, I feel so much for the people of Ukraine because these conversations are going absolutely nowhere because Putin knows that basically Trump is either on his side or so neutral that he can just carry on. Canada seems to be leading us at the moment. I mean, Europe, we've talked before on this podcast about the need for Europe to unite and to start spending more on defense and all that sort of thing. But, one's still not convinced. And, the way that Carney's sort of leading us, it seems to be the way forward, where he clearly said this is a rupture. This isn't a temporary thing. This is a major rupture in our relations with the United States. And then we come to the USA itself. I mean, there are splits in the MAGA movement, but who would you put your money on winning the next presidential election? Very polarized, of course, but Vance is, possibly going to win. I can't see a return to a sort of democratic liberal sort of the West Wing type president. I think the Democrats are going to be affected to some extent, and not always in a good way by this. I think there's permanent damage being done to the United States.
The one person I didn't mention when I ran through the list of critics of Donald Trump this week was Gavin Newsom, who was interesting. He popped up in Davos, and he's clearly started to make waves domestically and now internationally because he's got this podcast that he does apparently, which is very popular in the States. He's then managed to get himself a TikTok account, which he just basically takes the piss out of Donald Trump, apparently very effectively. And it's clearly wound the president up as well, because Gavin Newsom is one of the few Democrats that he name checks, and obviously not in a particularly flattering way. Newsom's problem, of course, is he's California, and it's whether or not the American people would elect a Californian as president. But he's trying to become that sort of unofficial leader of the opposition. And it's one of the problems with the American system, actually, isn't it, Joe? Is we decried earlier the fact that, for too long we've not really had an opposition party to the government that we've got at the moment. But in the States, they don't have an official leader of the opposition. So you've got various voices from Bernie Sanders to AOC to Mandami in New York to Gavin Newsom, but quite a disparate group of people not really acting as a collective, and therefore not having a consistent view of how you oppose Trump and his attacks, not just in terms of his international policy, which obviously concerns us greatly, but also what he's doing to American democracy at home.
No, absolutely. And it's always been a complete mystery to me that who the president is, whoever it is, but you don't know who the leader of the opposition is. And that's obviously for many reasons of America's extraordinary system and the fact it's so vast and there are multiple time zones and all of that. The thing that worries me is that because Trump is so unstable and he is surrounded by such ghastly people like Stephen Miller and the Gnome Woman and all the others, that he could very easily use the Insurrection Act to suspend the midterm elections. So here we are talking about suspending our little council elections. there's nothing to stop Trump. He doesn't give a damn. I mean, even if the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do it, he doesn't care. He would just go ahead and do it. And I think if you get to that point where you suspend elections, that you've actually now got some Republicans who are beginning to say, hang on a minute, this whole ICE stuff has gone too far. Trump's talking about sending the National Guard in. Well, okay, you send the National Guard in, then you are saying we've got insurrection. And I think that's why Tim Walz, who's the governor of Minneapolis, is trying to sort of calm everything down, because he can see very clearly that that would actually play into Trump's hands if protesters, and bearing in mind, I think it was 15,000 people went out in the bitter, bitter cold onto the streets to protest against the killing of this intensive care nurse over the weekend. So there is a whole movement going on. But of course, you know, until people actually stand up to Trump, and I do think that has to be us and Mark Carney and Europe, and it actually means saying, we're not going to trade with you anymore. You know, when you think of what Canada sends to America and how dependent America is on a lot of stuff that comes from Canada, you know, Carney can do exactly the same as Trump and say, sorry, we're cutting that off, actually. And I think we are in a very, very, very dangerous place. You know, it was only 2 weeks ago we were talking about what was going on in Iran, and Trump was saying, hold on, help's coming. Well, Here we are 2 weeks later, nothing's happened. Iran's gone off the news because we've all been talking about Andy Burnham. Meanwhile, we're told that a US fleet is moving out towards Iran. It only takes one mistake for the whole place to erupt. You know, Iran attacks Israel, America gets involved. You know, we've got Venezuela, which is now out of the news, but apparently is not a happy place. And even the oil companies are saying, you know, we're not that keen. It's not great for us. So everything he touches, it just seems to create more chaos. It's like lighting a touch paper and just setting it off around the globe.
Yeah, and he appears to enjoy it because he just wants to be right in the middle of it, in the centre of attention all the time. I think it's difficult for even Canada, but certainly for Europe and the UK, to be much more robust with Trump and America than they've been thus far, because, of course, we talk about trade, and there will be an opportunity for Europe to put tariffs on and all that sort of thing, and the UK can potentially link with the EU in doing that. What we forget, though, is how much now modern society relies on the internet and all these things that we take for granted now, and everything is automated and everything is controlled. From your phone to the stuff that go, you know, Alexa at home and your fridge, and everything works off the basically satellites in our skies, which are controlled by who? 70%.
Mr. Musk.
By the Americans. So I know we've said this before, but the idea that, you know, Keir Starmer or any other European leader can simply say, well, buggy it, we're just going to go and plough our own furrow. It's just not possible, because we are so reliant, Jim, on American technology, not just for our everyday, the way we work, the way we play, the way we operate, but also, of course, for defence.
Yes, and this is the delicate balance that Keir Starmer is trying to right, you know, and we were talking earlier on about his weak leadership, and that's what's provoked the whole Burnham situation. But, you know, just to give a little bit of credit on the other side, whilst all that Gorton stuff was going on, Starmer made a very robust, I mean, he'd done no alternative in many ways, but very robust objection to what Trump had said about our troops not being in the front line. And, you know, and along with a note from the King, by the way, that's pretty unprecedented. Apparently, a note from King Charles was put in the diplomatic bag for the sight of the president. So, you know, so Starmer, and it's very interesting to see how the various people, some people seem basically to have torn up the relationship. People like Carney, to a lesser extent Macron, but Starmer is still trying to navigate this for the reasons that you've said. You know, we still rely on the United States. for defence. I mean, it's unthinkable, but it's possible that Trump will just really pull the rug from under the Ukrainians, and then we really will have an existential problem on our hands.
Yeah.
So there's all that, and as you say, with all the technology, all these wretched technology companies with all their might and being out of control, and that's another debate. We haven't got time for that today about how, the parents' revolt against them is an interesting social phenomenon which we need to talk about. But we are still very dependent on it, and I do give credit to Starmer for sort of clinging on to this thing, because grand gestures are fine, but with this president you just don't know what the consequences would be of a complete breach.
Correct. I think the other thing that we should finally mention, perhaps, on international affairs, and something that, of course, is the UK government's responsibility by and large, and it's the Chagos Islands and the relationship with Mauritius. So we're now being told that the government are on the verge of a U-turn from this disastrous deal that they did with Mauritius and Chagos Islands, just to hand back control of an island that has been, I guess, sort of part of our ownership for hundreds of years now.
1814, I remember reporting on its acquisition during the Napoleonic Wars.
I knew you'd be able to tell me. But there's an awful lot of hypocrisy around this issue. And it's one of the things I have to say that James Cleverly is in particular gone down in my estimation over. I know politicians sort of play politics. It's what they do, and oppositions criticise what the government's doing. It's part of the game. But when you've been the guy who's actually negotiated the deal for the Chagos Islands, you've signed the first bit of paper that gets the process on the way, you hand it over to the next government, and then all of a sudden you say, this is a terrible deal, you're selling us out. I think your mate really does need to have a look at himself in the mirror, Jim, and the Conservative Party more generally, because it was the Tories who did this initial deal to hand the Chagos Islands back. But now it's been reviewed because the Americans, who up until very recently had also said they were happy with the deal, have decided, oh, well, maybe this is something we need to look at again. What do you make of all this? I know little or nothing about the Chagos Islands, other than, as I've said, we've had ownership of it for a long, long time, and there's a bloody big, huge, strategic American military base there, which, of course, would have stayed there for another 100 years had this deal gone through.
Well, yes. It's become a huge issue, and it doesn't reflect very well on the government. But it is important to note that, yes, James Cleverly, when he was Foreign Secretary, started it, and it was a UN directive. It was not a binding legal thing. It just said, you should give this back to Mauritius. Well, and then David Cameron, when he was Foreign Secretary, cancelled the deal, which is where it should have stayed. And then this government, the Labour government, brought it back in because I think, that sort of lawyerly aspect of Keir Starmer, international law, we've got to abide by. But David Lammy, when he was Foreign Secretary, said last year, we will not go ahead with this unless the Americans are happy with it. Now, you can't tell me that however stupid Donald Trump is, they haven't got teams of lawyers who would have looked at it and gone, no, this is a dead duck. We don't want this. And they're only now coming back in because I think they're seeing it as something. I mean, it is utterly bonkers. There is no need for us to do it. And the cost is absolutely astronomical to the Mauritian government, with whom we have a reasonable relationship. But, it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean, for goodness sake. So if somebody else wants to go and get cozy with Mauritius, where does that leave us? We're paying taxpayers' money for something that we already had access to. So I think it ought to be canned completely. And actually, in a way, if America says we don't want it,
gets us off the hook.
Yeah, it lets us off the hook, and we go, okay, fine, all right, and then you just move on.
I think I've never understood but why we were contemplating the deal. Certainly never understood why we'd be paying them like billions of pounds in compensation. And apparently there was an idea mooted at Treasury level, but basically kiboshed by the Foreign Office, that we offer America the opportunity to buy it off us, which to me seems like the art of the deal, really. Jim, do you know much more about this particular issue? And on a further point, does it again evidence the lack of politics in Starmer and his sidekick is Lord Hamer, isn't it? The guy who advises him on into say again, Jim? Hermer.
Yeah.
Certainly not a politician, right? And so this to me, just politically naive again, Jim.
Yes, I mean it seemed to me to be a sort of, I think rather naively, they were doing a bit of sort of tidying up, decolonization, tidying up, and wanted to conform to this advisory judgment that we didn't have a right to these islands. Of course, there's a bit more history involving a former Labour Prime Minister here, because in the 1960s, Harold Wilson did deport the Chagossian people so that the American base could be built in the first place. And that's always been, a very controversial thing to have done. A lot of them now live in England, and they live in the Crawley area of Sussex, bizarrely.
Which is where the MP is from, who actually voted against the government.
Right, and they've not really been taken. So we've, the government seems to be focused on sort of tidying up a bit of colonial history, but they hadn't done much for the Chagossian people, who may or may not, they're divided, as I understand it, whether they want to go back to those islands or not. But in the situation we've reached now, and I mean, I'm not putting up a defense of James Cleverly at all, but the China's expansionism is growing year by year. The way they're behaving in the South China Sea. There are suggestions that they're quite friendly with the Maldives government. Sorry, with the government that we're handing it over to. But to do this at this time, and I mean the reason for the lease back. I mean, Kemi Badenoch is aggregating up 93 billion. That's over the 99 years that we would lease it back from the Mauritian government. But strategically, it is not something we should be doing in an unsafe world.
Why are we paying it as well if it's a bloody big American airbase there? The Yanks should be having to pay that. So, no, I think it's a bad deal. I think I don't blame Kemi Badenoch, by the way, for playing politics with that figure, because it's exactly what any opposition would do. It's 93 billion over however many years, still 93 billion quid. So, no, I think that's something that we may, bizarrely, thank Trump's lunacy for, because if we do review that decision, end up backing off from that initial deal, and that I think would be a good thing. But I think he also needs to look at Herman and maybe move him out and somebody with some politics in.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Emily Thornberry, who would have expected to get that job, is very, very effective as chair of the the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and has got much more freedom to speak, and does so, very articulately and very well. So from her point of view, although it was a ghastly move if you've shadowed that role for a long time, and then this bloke who's never done politics. But again, as is so often the case, it's another crisis that didn't need to happen.
Yeah, Emily Thornberry would have been much better in that job. I think that boat has probably sailed, but there'll be other people about with politics in them who could do that role. So he needs to get them in. Right, I think we've probably... the only other thing to say, of course, is Keir Starmer himself's going to China this week, isn't he? To meet the powers that be there, and we'll see what he returns with. He's gone, obviously, on the back of granting planning permission for this huge Chinese embassy in London. So I'm sure he's going to get a warm welcome, red carpet and all.
I'm sure he will, but there is a judicial review being launched against that, and it is just worth reminding people a little historical fact, that plot of land, which was Crown Estate, was sold originally to a property developer who was going to turn it into flats and retail and all the usual nonsense. Boris Johnson, when he was Foreign Secretary, appointed Eddie Lister, who had been his right-hand man at City Hall, to negotiate a deal with the Chinese. Eddie Lister was therefore being paid by the British government, and also, according to the Sunday Times from years and years ago, by the property company. So, you know, if you want to look back at bad things, quite often they all come back to Boris Johnson.
So often is the case.
Absolutely.
So often is the case, but there you go. Right, before we go then, let's have just a quick roundup of the weekend's football. I'm off to our magnificent new stadium this evening to see Everton entertain Leeds United. But Jo, another win for West Ham.
I know, 3 in a row. It's marvellous, isn't it? I mean, we might actually avoid relegation, which is all that West Ham fans ever say. We don't want to be relegated. Although I have to say, I have very fond memories when we were in the Championship on a wet Wednesday evening, because the pressure's off and sometimes you see better football. But yes, I'm glad.
And now VAR. That's the thing.
Yeah,
Jim,
exactly.
Plymouth won, I think, did they, at the weekend?
We most certainly did, yes. Unbeaten this year. Won 6 of our last 7 away games. And we're now eyeing up the playoffs rather than the relegation zone. So whether it's Tom or James, Cleverly's the one.
Very good. And of course, a big shout out for Bournemouth, who scored the winner, the last kick of the game, and against what's that other team? Liverpool. Oh yeah, that was a very entertaining game. Just a shout out.
Don't be mean to our producer.
Yeah, Francesca's wincing there. Now, I shout out as well, actually, to I don't do this very often, but to Gary Neville and Manchester United fans, because what a great win for them at Arsenal yesterday as well. So quite an entertaining weekend of football. And if we win tonight, Everton go 7th in the Premier League, 1 point behind the reigning champions. Of course, Everton won't win tonight. Dominic Calvert-Lewin will score a hat-trick and I'll be crying in my beer by 11 o'clock. But that's for another day. Next week, we will be back. We'll be talking about the fallout from the Andy Burnham soap opera. We'll no doubt be talking about Keir Starmer's visit to China and much more besides, I'm sure. Thanks for joining us again. We'll spend the next 7 days attempting to release Jim Hancock from his Russian bot. Get him back on camera for you next week, where he will appear in either a pink, red, or perhaps turquoise jumper. Have a great week, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.